Hey, it's been a minute. Sorry for disappearing for a month. I was busy consuming enough energy drinks to drown a horse while I crunched through my final semester of school, and then I decided to do a donathon over on Twitch that's been slightly taking over my entire life. However, I'm here now. And now it's time to talk about something that everyone is undoubtedly excited for, a discussion of philosophy and ideological worldviews within the context of a video game. Nobody's ever done that before, right? Now, this video is not going to be exhaustive or definitive, because kind of by definition, philosophy is really neither of those things. Philosophy is a fun thing to talk about because you can talk yourself in circles forever and ever. If you ask two philosophers a question and leave them alone in a room with it for 20 minutes, they'll probably end up disagreeing with each other and themselves before you even close the door. This video is also going to assume that none of us here are philosophy majors, and we'll be taking a philosophy for dummies approach, because if you are a philosophy major, you're probably too busy role-playing Socrates by being annoying in public spaces and not having any friends to be here. Instead, we're going to focus on broad strokes. Crucially, this is a piece of entertainment, not my thesis, so set expectations appropriately. Also, this is one part of a two-part series. Initially, my channel members chose the philosophies of Overwatch's heroes as the topic for this video, but I kind of realized there's a lot more to that than I anticipated and I wanted to talk about it more, so I decided to split it in half. This video is a lot of the setup. It'll go over the organizations within the universe of Overwatch as well as talk more about some of the basic concepts of philosophy. And we are talking like real basic shit here, like what is philosophy as a concept and what does it mean to do a philosophy assuming you have no idea what's going on. The second one won't be out for a couple days after this one releases, just to give this video some time to breathe, but if you're watching this after the 15th, then I'd still recommend watching this one first. That one is going to assume you've seen this one in order to have to avoid explaining a bunch of shit over and over again. But if you're not worried about that, there'll be a card for it right up there in the top right. Now, before we start, some quick channel updates. First of all, the winner of the October Members' Choice video poll was the right and wrong ways to use your characters. If you'd like to vote in future polls, including polls where some of these topics will come back, you can become a channel member by clicking the join button below for $5 a month. I apologize for falling behind on my video schedule over the last few weeks, but now that school's over, I am really excited to actually get back into it. Second, I'm running a donathon this month over at twitch.tv/thevivaros. For the unfamiliar, a donathon is where viewers can extend the length of a streaming marathon by donating through subs, bits, or other donations. In my case, also through super thanks or channel memberships here on YouTube. Reaching certain thresholds will unlock rewards, both for the community and the individual who donated, such as bonus videos, extra emotes, artwork, special Discord roles, and more. If you'd like to learn more, you can pause and read the information on screen now, and the link to the Twitch channel is in the description below. Lastly, as I have alluded to, there's a Discord server now for the community. The link is in the description, and I'd be happy to have you join. The server is 18+, and there is an age verification process that you'd have to go through if you want to join. It's not an NSFW server, just want to make that clear up front. I just know that my community is big enough that the server could get difficult to moderate in a hurry, and I don't want to add on the stress of having to fight off every freak looking for a 16-year-old Discord kitten. If you're a minor who doesn't like being excluded, I promise you are welcome to join once you turn 18, and I also promise you'll realize this was the right thing to do to protect people who are under 18 approximately 30 seconds after turning 18 and beginning to process the fucked up ways adults on the internet behave. If you're a Twitch sub or a YouTube channel member, be sure to link those accounts to your Discord as well to get access to special roles and channels for supporters. Alright, now, on to the video. Part 1. The broad strokes. Philosophy is a broad and nebulous concept kinda in and of itself. The Oxford definition is that it is the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence, especially when considered as an academic discipline. The term itself literally refers to the love of wisdom. It's kind of the first thing I want to note here. Philosophy is not as much about intelligence as wisdom, if you want to make that distinction, in the sense that it's less about knowing a lot of things and more about how you can apply the things you know to the world to gain a deeper understanding of how things work. The most obvious example of this that people are likely to be familiar with is Descartes' cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. This comes from Meditations on First Philosophy, where Descartes tries to determine what, if anything, is actually true or real. He questions everything he believes or assumes about the world, calling everything into doubt that can be called into doubt, especially considering it's possible someone might be deceiving him about the reality of those things. Thus, everything from the sun and the moon and the stars in the sky are all called into question before Descartes eventually realizes that he must exist. If he is capable of being convinced of something, then he must exist. And if he is capable of being deceived, then he must exist as something that can be deceived. Ergo, I think, therefore I am. I am capable of thought, therefore I must exist. This is actually a concept that's directly invoked in Overwatch by Zenyatta in his voice lines, with one voice line of the original quote, as well as a second one where he says, "Do I think? Does a submarine swim?" And you can already see where the philosophy in the context of something like Overwatch can actually get pretty fun to think about if you're a colossal nerd. As a human being, I think, therefore I am. But what is thinking? Does an omnic think? In a lot of contexts, we have a different verb for something that a machine or inanimate object does versus something a living creature does. A boat sails, but a person swims. A wagon rolls, but a human runs. Then again, if someone in a wheelchair moves forward in their wheelchair, they are rolling, but they're obviously still human. Zenyatta, then, poses an interesting challenge to Descartes by asking what constitutes thinking, the act, and who gets to do it. Maybe you've heard the names of some ancient philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, or Confucius, or maybe even some of the relatively more modern ones ranging from Karl Marx, John Locke, Niccolo Machiavelli, or Nicholas Copernicus, or the actually modern ones ranging from people like Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer to Abigail Thorne and Natalie Wynn. However, it's important to recognize that philosophy goes beyond simply regurgitating the words of a handful of very smart people who've long since turned to dust, or those who are still making YouTube video essays today. For example, philosophy concerns itself with how an argument can be developed to be logically consistent. If A, and if B, then C. If it is true that I made this YouTube video, and anyone who makes YouTube videos is a YouTuber, then I am a YouTuber. Philosophers not only concern themselves with whether the individual elements of the argument are sound or follow some sort of philosophical beliefs, but also whether the structure of the argument is sound, the logic of it. In this equation, A is that I am someone who makes YouTube videos. B is that anyone who makes YouTube videos is a YouTuber. If those two statements are true, then it logically holds that C is true, that I am a YouTuber. Therefore, the argument structure is sound. However, you might take issue with the conditions. After all, that word if is doing some heavy lifting there. I made this YouTube video by myself, so that part's hard to dispute in this case, but what if I had an editor, or a thumbnail artist, or someone who animated my videos or something? Are they YouTubers too? If so, why? If not, where's the line in the sand? The second part, if anyone who makes a YouTube video is a YouTuber, is also debatable. You might argue that not everyone who makes YouTube videos is a YouTuber, that there must be some other condition to that. Do they have to have a regular upload schedule? Do they have to be monetized? Do they have to be a certain size? Does YouTube have to be their primary profession, or does it count if it's a side hustle, or even just a hobby? Does their content have to be originally created for YouTube, or is it enough if they re-upload their TikToks as YouTube shorts or their Twitch streams as videos? Does the term YouTube video only apply to full-length videos, or do shorts count? What if they're uploading somebody else's TikToks? This style of checking your logic might actually be familiar to people who have experience with coding, where if and else if statements are a pretty 101 concept, which you might then use to argue in favor of Zenyatta's position that he is thinking, even if we, use a different form than he does. The implications of this also don't end at Zenyatta. Like any good discussion of philosophy, it quickly spirals further. Whether we accept or reject Zenyatta's premise, then that'll affect how every other character's actions in Overwatch are perceived, omnic or otherwise. Accepting the premise means accepting that omnics do fundamentally exist as sentient creatures on par with humanity, meaning that Reinhardt's kind of a piece of shit for how he treats omnics in situations like the Liberation PvE mission at the end. It also makes humanity's treatment of the Omnics much more objectively fucked up, and in turn affects whether or not Ramatra is justified in his aims. It also begs the question of where we draw the line. Sure, Zenyatta and Ramatra have true consciousness as a consequence of Aurora's sacrifice, but do Bastion, Echo, and Orisa? Bastion seems to not have sentience, at least not on par with the others, so much as his original programming got corrupted and now he's got amnesia, but he's a nicer guy. While Echo and Orisa were both built after Aurora's sacrifice and so don't technically have that sentience. Do all of them deserve to be classified alongside Zenyatta and Ramatra? Do any of them? What is the line in the sand between omnics who think like a submarine swims versus those who are simply following programming? And if there isn't one, what is the difference between a human being and a computer program? What allows Ramatra to become an omnic deserving of saving his own mind versus the countless mindless bots he sends forward in Null Sector? I'm getting ahead of myself though. This is meant to be the broad strokes about what philosophy is as like a baseline. Philosophy isn't some sort of a tech tree that you spec into, and it's not a hard science that can be quantifiably measured. Philosophy is about not just what we know, but why we think we know, how we know, what it means to know, how it reflects our ethics and morals, what is ethical and moral for us to do, and that affects a lot of things. Philosophy is often kind of dismissed as something either frivolous or unnecessary. Just try telling your parents that you want to major in philosophy. Or as something pretentious where everyone's got their heads up their asses and is overthinking themselves. However, it's also a much more all-encompassing thing than that. Economics, for example, are far more philosophical than people really give it credit for. After all, while things like socialism and capitalism are economic models, they are still built out from philosophical positions revolving around how wealth should be distributed and what constitutes an ethical organization of the economy. Philosophy talks a lot about how to know whether something is moral or ethical and what the boundaries are, setting actual frameworks within which to examine your actions. That might sound like an impossible task, and it kinda is. Philosophers are constantly revisiting questions that have been asked for centuries or even millennia to see if there's a new way of looking at it that could reveal a new school of thought. Philosophy is something that can be applied to the individual to evaluate what motivates someone, what that person should do if they're being ethical, or whether their conduct is moral or immoral. However, it can also be applied to bigger concepts like governments, ranging from discussions of policies to what form of governance is morally and ethically best, or even just acceptable. Should it be a monarchy, governed by an anointed holy leader chosen by God through their powerful bloodline? Should it be a democracy, where governance is determined, at least in theory, by the people? Should it be a dictatorship, where the powerful rule on the basis of their power alone? In other words, philosophy's kinda everywhere. It governs, whether consciously or subconsciously, everything from the structures we live under to the wars we're willing to fight to the way we construct meaning and purpose in media. And that's what we're going to talk about next. Part 2. Philosophy in Gaming. Media in general is always going to reflect a philosophical position, whether intentionally or unintentionally, both in terms of the in-universe philosophies of the characters as well as how those philosophies are framed within the media itself. Ramatra is the easiest example here from Overwatch, because Ramatra's philosophical position is pretty straightforward. We can use that if A and if B then C structure from earlier to examine it, although we'll need a couple more clauses. If Omnics are sentient on par with humanity, and if humanity is oppressive and violent towards Omnics in spite of Omnics' best efforts at peaceful coexistence, and if Omnics are a single-generation race due to being unable to replicate their sentience in future Omnics while humans are able to reproduce, then it is more important to protect Omnic lives than human lives, and from there it is then justified to use violence to fight for Omnic liberation and a homeland for the Omnics. That's basically his philosophy. However, we can also see the philosophy of the game as a whole reflected in how it treats Ramatra's philosophy. Namely, he's a villain, and his philosophical worldview is unquestionably morally wrong in the game's framing. That might seem obvious, but it's not an inevitability to frame him that way. That decision is not neutral. It is one that reflects an ideological worldview, a philosophy on what is and isn't moral, takes a side on what is or is not the right way to do things. Oftentimes, the characters in a piece of media will present different philosophical positions, but the media itself will act as the arbiter of what is or is not good. This is more obvious in games that are more explicitly interested in talking philosophy. BioShock is probably the most mainstream example of this, since each game generally revolves around an examination of one overarching philosophical stance. In the first game, it was objectivism, a philosophical position developed by Ayn Rand that's popular among many libertarians and conservatives because its basic argument is just, it's actually a good thing to be selfish, and you have a moral obligation to only look out for yourself. BioShock 2, on the other hand, goes with collectivism, which is a pretty opposite worldview, basically prioritizing the greater good of the group over any individual within it. BioShock Infinite takes on themes of American exceptionalism and class warfare, and also continues the classic liberal storytelling tradition of accidentally writing a story where your freedom fighters are objectively morally correct by your own philosophical position, but you don't actually agree with them, so you have to make them do something completely insane that's totally out of character to make sure everyone knows that the solution should actually be found somewhere in the middle. That the gravest sin in this floating city of sky racists is to take too strong of a stance against the sky racists, because isn't that extremism too? Why can't we all just meet in the middle? Overwatch players will, again, be familiar with this if they have ever looked at how Blizzard portrays Ramatra or the Omnic Resistance in general. A more interesting game that does this is Disco Elysium, where players can choose to align themselves with communists, fascists, centrists, or neoliberals, as well as make their character racist or anti-racist, feminist or anti-feminist, etc. Part of what makes Disco Elysium so interesting from this, philosophical discussion is that it is written from a position that is not only generally willing to take jabs at everyone, but also that the authors are pretty leftist compared to what you see typically in gaming narratives. Famously, Zaum thanked Marx and Engels for their political education at the Game Awards in their victory speech, and you can see it in their writing. The game is a lot more critical of both the neoliberals and centrists, or ultraliberals and moralists in the game's vocabulary, than most games are. And regardless of your politics, it's a good example of how philosophy isn't just reflected in what the characters in a game say, but also how the game frames it. The game does not assume centrism. It forces you to choose it if you want it, and creates consequences for that choice just like any other. It's also ultimately not pretending to be neutral either. The game's achievements calls centrism laughable, mocks neoliberal hustlers, and describes the fascists as truly rabid. But if you pick communism, well, you're just the biggest communism builder. If you think communism is bad, Zaum will let you think that's an insult too, but it is certainly not as upfront as the other three in deriding your philosophy. Particularly when it comes to centrism, which is the target of particular derision as a fence-sitting position by basically every character in the game who isn't a centrist. However, we're not here to talk about Disco Elysium. We're here to talk about Overwatch, and we have a lot of Overwatch to talk about. Part 3. The major organizations. The way we're going to do this is we're going to start with the big boys and work our way down from there. Overwatch has 3 major factions in terms of its narrative: Overwatch, Talon, and Null Sector, and we'll go over all 3 in some detail here. In part 4, we'll go over the minor organizations, and like I said earlier, the examination of individual heroes will be in the other video that I'm releasing in this, two-part series thing. I would strongly recommend watching this video first, again, to be clear, since that one will assume you're familiar with the orgs that we've talked about here. Think of this as the setup for the second one. Again, this won't be exhaustive, but I am doing my best to cover as much as I can while keeping this under 45 hours. Part 3.1, Overwatch. Overwatch was formed in response to the Omnic crisis as originally basically just a global military. They were given effectively limitless powers, privileges, and protections during the global war to enable them to end the crisis that were extended into the post-war period. At its height, Overwatch was indisputably the dominant global power, not just militarily, but also politically, socially, and culturally. In this sense, we might view them through the lens of Antonio Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony, where one ruling class has dominance over a diverse society and uses that dominance to try and mold that diverse society's culture to match its own. The idea is that the dominant class, in this case Overwatch and the people on its side, get to use its power not only to impose a status quo, but to misrepresent that status quo as both natural and ideal for everyone involved. Gramsci was a Marxist and developed this concept as part of a bigger philosophical argument about how the process of overthrowing capitalism requires, winning the war for position, which could be described as more simply the battle for the hearts and minds of the people. Cultural hegemony is then something that the workers must fight back against by developing their own working class culture that can be used to break other workers out of the trance of the hegemons and can then win the war for position. Overwatch was undoubtedly hegemonic and was undoubtedly using its power to establish itself as the default, the status quo, and the inherently good. I mean, they had a fucking cartoon representing them as heroes. Their agents were mythologized as legends with action figures, despite the fact that they were clearly up to some shady shit, particularly in Blackwatch. However, the question remains, what is Overwatch's actual philosophical stance? They're clearly a global hegemon, but if they're a cultural hegemon, what is the dominant ideology that they're imposing? In a lot of ways, it's not super clear. In large part because the game's narrative doesn't really question the organization's presentation as the good guys far enough to really get into it. Everyone can be a hero in Overwatch, everyone can be a good guy, and the only wrong cultural position in the eyes of Overwatch is to be a bad guy. And to be a bad guy is to go against the status quo. But what's the status quo? Overwatch doesn't really go out of its way to state it explicitly, but I'd argue that this actually kind of tells us something. Namely, this is a bit of a hallmark of liberalism, the philosophical position generally credited to John Locke. Liberalism is a broad philosophical concept, like extremely broad. Like, there's a lot of schools of liberalism, but an important element of it for our purposes is that it is not only the current dominant ideological position on the global scale in the real world, meaning that it makes sense for Overwatch to be a continuation of it, but also its love of not marketing itself as an ideology. Liberalism enjoys the privileges of global cultural hegemony because it not only attempts to market itself as the natural, neutral, objectively true philosophical stance, but it generally succeeds. Liberals are the center of the political spectrum for a reason. The Overton window, or the window of discourse, puts them at the center because they are the ones whose views are treated not as an ideology, but as a fact, and liberals like to keep it that way. Part of why I mentioned Disco Elysium earlier is because it honestly takes a pretty radical stance in positioning the current political center that we'd associate with liberalism as cowardly, spineless, or fence-sitting position, or even just treating it like an actual ideology rather than just the default. It does not assume the center, but forces you to choose it. Overwatch, both the game and the organization, assume the center. Thus, while neither the organization or the game market themselves as a proponent of the philosophy of liberalism, I argue that's pretty obviously where they land. However, over time, Overwatch collapsed. Now it has no money, no power, no resources, no allies, and no legitimacy. Its fall from grace reflects the cycle of power from multipolarity to bipolarity to unipolarity, and then back to chaos of multipolarity that I talked about in my Why Balancing Overwatch is So Hard video. Eventually, the global superpower in a hegemonic state collapses, and the world has to reorganize. Overwatch fell, and now it's just another player in the game. But crucially, liberalism did not stop being the dominant ideology. The change in the Overwatch universe is not from liberalism to another philosophical stance dominating the global order, only from one bastion of liberalism to the others. Overwatch as an organization still holds its same general philosophy, only now it does so without the backing of the world's governments who have once again become more fractured and independent in the face of another crisis. Part 3.2, Talon. Talon is a bit of a difficult organization to get a grasp on because their aims are underdeveloped, and this is honestly mostly a consequence of Overwatch's narrative seeming to shift over the years. Initially, Overwatch's story was mostly just Overwatch versus Talon, good guys versus bad guys, and was pretty generally straightforward. However, if you've paid attention over the years, you can really see that begin to shift, most noticeably after Sombra's debut and the introduction of a new global force ostensibly controlling everything behind the scenes. The story became more complicated, Talon's nature as a surface-level group of villains became harder to maintain, and in Overwatch 2 they've kind of been sidelined in favor of Null Sector as primary antagonists. However, their philosophy is still pretty simple. Humanity is weak and can only be strengthened through conflict. This isn't like about training people to become stronger through fighting or whatever. It's talking about humanity as a collective group that will be made collectively stronger through conflict, because it will inevitably kill off the weak and leave only the strong. You might have heard of this concept as social Darwinism, survival of the fittest taken to the extreme. The strong should get stronger and the weak should get weaker. The softer version of this is just that wealth and political power should coalesce among the strong and vacate the weak, while the harder version of this is that the weak should be explicitly subjugated or exterminated by the strong to create a stronger species. Darwinism itself is about evolution. The idea in biology that distinct species develop through natural variations from generation to generation, with the strongest of these variations being the most likely to survive and propagate, passing on those variants to future generations that will iterate upon them further. Most people know about it, but most people also misunderstand it. You have to recognize that the individual variations are random, not reactive to the circumstances. Variations might be helpful, but they might be neutral or even actively unhelpful. And what classifies as helpful is very contextual, not just in terms of location, but also point in time. Social Darwinism takes a concept from biology and applies it to society, and if you know anything about social Darwinism, you probably know its consequences were fucking devastating. What Talon is fighting for is functional eugenics, a discredited belief that society can be improved by either sterilizing those deemed to be inferior, as was done in Alberta through the Alberta Eugenics Board from 1922 to 1972, or by outright killing them, as was done by the Nazis through the Holocaust. In analyzing Talon's philosophy, it's also kind of worth asking if it stops at just this level of social Darwinism, or if it goes further. Namely, is Talon fascist? There's a tendency to assume that fascism is simply synonymous with being evil, or being a bad person, or being a bad group of people, but it does actually have specific characteristics that we can look at to see where Talon stands. Umberto Eco's 1995 essay, Ur Fascism, argues that there are 14 general principles of fascism, but it's important to recognize that not all of them need to be present for there to be fascism. Any one of them could be treated as enough for fascism to coagulate around, and Talon does strike a couple of them. The most obvious of these is the 10th principle, contempt for the weak. Talon also generally embraces, to various extents, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 13th principles, which are respectively the rejection of modernism, the cult of action for action's sake, disagreement is treason, fear of difference, obsession with a plot, enemies who are at the same time too strong and too weak, life is permanent warfare, and selective populism. I don't think it's particularly hard to argue that Talon is, at a bare minimum, fascist adjacent. And if it steps like a goose, it's probably goose stepping. Part 3.3. Null Sector. Null Sector are the last of the really big factions within the conflict of Overwatch, and oh wow, there is sure a lot of stuff happening there. First properly introduced in the first Overwatch Archives event, Uprising, they're one of the two factions most associated with the Omnic Liberation Movement, with the other being the Shambali Monastery. Null Sector and the Shambali each represent one of two different visions of how to achieve liberation, with Null Sector's approach being one that utilizes violence to achieve its ends, ostensibly with the goal of forcing the world's governments to give them their own Omnic nation. Null Sector has given up on peaceful coexistence with humanity, arguing that humanity has proven itself to either be fundamentally incapable or fundamentally unwilling to do so, exacerbated by the fact that Omnics are a single-generation species in terms of sentience. Every dead Omnic is truly dead and gone, and there is no way to make new ones that possess sentience. As a result, Null Sector's position is that a human life is worth less than an Omnic life, because humanity can recover its losses. Omnics can't. Now, there is an obvious temptation to connect Omnics to real-world oppression, to connect the Shambali and Null Sector to real-world organizations, or even to connect Zenyatta and Ramatra to real-world activists and leaders. This isn't helped by the fact that Blizzard, in their infinite wisdom, thought they were the ones to offer coherent commentary on racial segregation and oppression through their robot racism analogy. However, as I've discussed in my Overwatch's Omnics are shallow storytelling video, I don't think we should do that. Blizzard's handling of the Omnics is poorly conceived and poorly planned, and the real-world scenarios that Overwatch's Omnics seem analogous to, whether intentionally or unintentionally, are not ones I think should be trivialized by comparing it to this kind of shitty metaphorical standing group for oppression. At the end of the day, Omnics are man-made machines that develop sentience in a miraculous religious transcendence within living memory. They do not need food or water, they can functionally do magic if they pray hard enough, they are unable to reproduce, they are not at risk of diseases that they don't have the appropriate immune system for, and so much more. The concept of this struggle is so fundamentally different from any real-world scenario that it would be genuinely offensive to try and make the comparison to any of them. Even in trying to find an analogy that I could use to make an example of why this wouldn't be appropriate, I couldn't come up with any real-world scenario to compare this to that wouldn't come across as profoundly intellectually dishonest as well as deeply disrespectful to all parties. So, I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to ask that you not do that in the comments either. Null Sector's beliefs hinge on a couple key premises, which we talked about earlier, that Omnics are a single-generation species, and that humanity is either unwilling or unable to peacefully coexist with them. Null Sector believes that humanity sees no reason to give a shit about the Omnics. They're too small, they're too weak, and there's no consequence for not caring about them, so human governments and organizations have mostly just let it continue. There's a concept you might have heard of called life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all, part of the American Declaration of Independence. Canada also has a version of this in our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, where it's about life, liberty, and security of the person. This idea comes from John Locke. Life, liberty, and the security of the person, pursuit of happiness. Some variation of that is usually part of it. Null sector is identifying that the liberal notion of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all, or security of the person, is not being afforded to everyone, because, just like many classical liberal thinkers, including John Locke, humanity at large has decided to draw a line in the sand on who gets to be part of the all in that situation. And in this instance, omnics are on the wrong side of the line. Null sector's philosophy is to basically try to place the cost of oppression on the oppressors rather than just the oppressed. That the asymmetrical power dynamic between humanity and omnics requires humanity to want to end the oppression. And given that appealing to liberal notions of egalitarianism, peace, and liberty hasn't worked, their only option is to introduce cost. If humanity won't do better for the sake of the omnics, for the sake of their values, well, they'd better do it for the sake of their fellow humans, who are going to start incurring the cost of oppression directly through death, destruction, and terror alongside the omnics. And Null Sector is leaving it in humanity's hands whether they're okay with incurring that cost. You might think that's risky gamble, given that it could very easily make things worse for the omnics if humans get vengeful, and that Null Sector is almost certainly going to make things worse for themselves. However, you have to remember that Null Sector believes this is their only option, that humanity will never agree to peace without introducing that cost to them, and that without peace, omnics are going extinct. To Null Sector, this is the only option. Sure, failure would likely lead to their extinction, but isn't that what they're facing anyways if they go the route of the Shambali? Their belief is that all other roads inevitably lead to extinction, and that this one is the one where extinction is not inevitability. Their philosophy is that omnics have a right to exist, a right to live, a right to be. And if humanity is going to reject it, if humanity is not going to follow through on that, they have the right to fight back, that it is morally and ethically imperative to fight for the survival of their species. That mostly wraps up the bigger organizations of Overwatch, but before we move on to the small ones, I just want to remind you again, this is not exhaustive. Overwatch as a franchise does not explicitly engage with nuanced philosophical details about its organizations, and despite spending my unemployment rambling at strangers about opinions they didn't ask for on YouTube, I am not actually a philosopher. Put those two together, and you get the fact that I am simply some guy on the internet trying to find meaning in a piece of media, probably more meaning than the creators actually intended people to look for, and that the conclusions drawn from this should not be seen as definitive factual declarations. Remember, this is philosophy. We are not doing hard sciences here, and much of this comes down to a subjective interpretation based on minimal information about the organizations within the media, and if you disagree with my interpretations, sick. That's part of the point of the video. Also, if your thought is, wait, but my favorite hero is part of one of these organizations and they don't believe in that at all, don't forget, there will be a whole second video covering the philosophies of the heroes of Overwatch you can watch after this to see if that's addressed, or see if I don't know, call your favorite hero a fascist. Now, let's move on to Part 4, the minor organizations. For this section, we're going to try and keep it mostly short and sweet for each one, because most of these organizations are either pretty simple or just haven't been explained in much detail, and also because this video is already getting too long. Part 4.1, Blackwatch. Blackwatch was the covert ops team that did Overwatch's dirty work, taking full advantage of Overwatch's hegemonic power to do, well, stuff. Bad stuff. The best way to describe them is actually as the manifestation of the exceptions to liberalism, namely tenets like rights and liberty for all. When Overwatch was in power, it was the referee of the rules that it got to write, but a global superpower can't just win the game by whatever means necessary. It has to maintain confidence that it's winning the game mostly fairly, or it'll lose legitimacy and it'll bleed in the war for position. That doesn't mean it actually plays a fair game. It just has to put in the work to keep it secret and create plausible deniability if it all goes south. Liberalism's whole rights and liberty for all sentiment has always come with massive asterisks, just like every ideology does. The American Declaration of Independence and Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, like I talked about before, include those concepts of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and life, liberty, and security of the person respectively. Both of those are things that are treated as things that should be guaranteed to everyone, both of which derive directly from Locke's philosophy. However, you could look at the histories of both countries on indigenous issues alone to see that there are some pretty clear lines drawn in the sand over who gets to enjoy those things, and not everyone gets included in rights and liberty for all. Overwatch, the organization, used Blackwatch the same way that the United States uses the CIA, to enact the exceptions that protect the hegemon from threats to their dominance, either on a direct organizational level or on a more fundamental philosophical level. In other words, the philosophy of Blackwatch is the same as Overwatch. Liberalism. Sometimes you gotta play outside the rules of the game if you want to win. After Overwatch fell, Blackwatch went with it. In the present day of the game, some of its members are with Talon, like Reaper and Moira, while others have reunited with Overwatch, like Genji and Cassidy. Part 4.2, the Shimada clan. The Shimadas are a defunct organized crime syndicate who were formerly in control of Kanezaka. They generally seem to rule over their territory benevolently, taking an approach of, if we're good leaders, they'll let us rule. A notion, you could argue, reflects a philosophy of servant leadership. Servant leadership is a philosophical stance developed either in the 20th century or by Jesus Christ, which states that the leader should operate as a servant of their organization, or in this case, the community of Kanazaka, rather than the people working to serve the leader, with the idea being that through serving, rather than just leading, you can bring everyone to a higher height. It's a leadership philosophy that blends altruism with personal ambition, where ambition for more power leads to greater requirements to perform altruistically. Of course, it's worth noting that servant leadership is local. The people of the Shimada clan benefited from this, and the people of Kanazaka benefited from this, but the people around the world that the Shimadas were assassinating, who died at the hands of the weapons that they smuggled, probably didn't feel all too served. While servant leadership is generally treated as altruistic, it's important to remember that this is a philosophy based on serving your own group, not everyone. Part 4.3. The Vishkar Corporation. The Vishkar Corporation is a mega-corporation operating out of India that focuses on hard light technology and enforcing order where it sees chaos. They're technocratic utilitarians, which sounds complicated, so I'll break it down quickly. Technocracy is a philosophical stance that the power to govern should come from scientific or technical expertise, regardless of the consent of the governed, while utilitarianism is about doing the most good for the most people while doing the least harm to the fewest people. Vishkar's powers, the corporation gives them the ability to act as if they're the government in places like Rio, where they enforce curfews and penalize dissidents, and they believe their scientific expertise in hard light justifies their decisions even when they go against the will of the people. They're also very much so capitalists. It's not really about doing the most good, it's about Vishkar getting paid, as can be seen in the fact that they, were originally supposed to develop their technology and distribute it for free before the original founder died, and, now all of a sudden it's all about making money. Also, in their pursuit of Lifeweaver, after he decided to use the knowledge they provided him to develop BioLight and offer it to people in regions freely as they were suffering. Part 4.4. The Shambali Order. The Shambali Order is a group of Omnics in Nepal who represent the other side of the fight for Omnic liberation, namely, one that tries to achieve liberation through peaceful processes and spiritual reconciliation. Formerly led by Takarta Mandata before his assassination at the hands of Widowmaker, the organization denounced Null Sector's activities and believed that violence was not the solution. Instead, they take a spiritual approach. After spending years meditating on the nature of their existence after enlightenment at the hands of Aurora's sacrifice, the first sentient Omnic, they emerged to basically push the argument that humanity and Omnics are fundamentally equal on a spiritual level, that they are all one within the iris. The Shambali get a lot of their influence from Buddhism and Hinduism, particularly in terms of transcendence being a parallel to Buddhist or Hindu ideas of nirvana or moksha, respectively, freedom and liberation from the cycle of life and death through virtuous acts in life. This is an extreme oversimplification of this concept or this idea. Both Buddhism and Hinduism are extremely diverse religions with various beliefs about this concept, but this element is more than anything what the Shambali pulls from. Which creates some interesting implications, by the way. Namely, that nirvana/moksha is a liberation from a cycle of rebirth and death, which is a cycle Omnics explicitly have no way of experiencing. Their approach, then, seems to be survive long enough to achieve transcendence, and hopefully convince humans that achieving transcendence is not only possible for them, but something they can do by being kind and peaceful to each other, and especially the Omnics, so the Iris looks favorably upon them. Part 4.5. Los Muertos. Los Muertos is a fun little gang in Mexico that Sombra used to be part of. Depending on who you ask, they're either a group of criminal freaks taking advantage of the chaos of Mexico after the Omnic crisis, or they're a group of revolutionaries fighting back against the looting of Mexico by the rich who took advantage of the aftermath of the crisis to enrich themselves further. Sombra, during her time with Los Muertos, exposed the CEO of Lumerico for doing just that, which certainly gives the latter position a bit more credibility. The end of the Omnic crisis in a lot of countries led to similar conditions experienced in post-Soviet countries after the Soviet Union dissolved, while the oligarchs seized power and capital in the scramble, and Los Muertos' philosophy is basically just, absolutely fucking not to that. It's not like they're socialist revolutionaries or anything like that. I don't think I'd argue they really have any sort of a coherent ideological position. They basically just saw people taking advantage of a bad situation that made the average person's life worse and wanted to fight back. They are also pretty big proponents of transhumanism for the everyday person, not just the military augmentations of people like Soldier or Sojourn. Although Overwatch generally does seem to treat that sort of thing as more of like a, hey, look at this cool technology thing, more than a Deus Ex or Cyberpunk 2077 type of, we must contend with the realities of transhumanism on an ethical level. Part 4.6. The Junkers. The Junkers are one half the answer to the question, what happens if all you know about Australia is Mad Max and Pauline Hanson? And that mostly answers the Mad Max side. After the Australian Liberation Front did a terrorism on the Australian Omnium, and we'll get to them in a minute, the Junkers took over the wreckage, forming what I can only describe as a monarchy based on a combination of a fight club and a hatred for Omnics. They're generally pretty hateful towards Omnics, they're pretty brutal towards each other, and they're very might makes right. Their philosophy doesn't really go that much deeper than that. Part 4.7. The Australian Liberation Front. The ALF are the other half of the answer to the question, what happens if all you know about Australia is Mad Max and Pauline Hanson, that answers the Pauline Hanson side of things. It's a bigoted anti-omnic group that hates the idea of outsiders taking their land, and it's important to recognize that the ALF are not like indigenous Australians trying to achieve land back. Even Roadhog isn't indigenous to Australia, he's indigenous to New Zealand, and so him trying to pull some take back Australia shit also is not excusable. This is a xenophobic, terrorist organization who single-mindedly focused on eliminating the Australian Omnium that had been given to the Omnics to try and foster peaceful coexistence in the country. Their efforts led to a meltdown in the Omnium's core, destroying the facility and creating a massive amount of nuclear fallout. The organization is defunct, but its sentiment lives on. The Omnics are still the enemies of the people of the Outback, and they will fight appropriately if they see one. Part 4.8. The Ministries. The governing body of the city of Oasis, a city founded in Iraq by 8 leading scientists who felt that governments were overregulating their work and preventing them from achieving the level of progress humanity could be reaching. And in the minds of the Ministries, the level of progress humanity needed to survive. Their motivations for founding the city are very libertarian, a roided up version of liberalism that takes it a step further by arguing that people also need liberty from the state and all higher governance. That personal autonomy is paramount, and that the state needs to either get out of the way or be eliminated in order to make that progress. Funny thing about libertarians like the Ministries, though. Once they achieve autonomy from any higher governments, they really seem to like founding rigid technocratic governments that are totally unaccountable and impose their will upon the people with complete disregard for their personal autonomy. After all, if they don't like it, they're not forced to stay in Oasis, right? That's the free marketplace of ideas, baby. Freedom of movement, freedom of association, and the right to go wherever you want. Let's just pretend that there's no reason why someone in Oasis might feel like they have to stay there, or that people like Moira aren't using the city for the explicit purpose of doing unethical human experimentation on people without their consent. It's a highly educated, wealthy technocracy with a real disdain for the limitations imposed not just by government regulation, but notions of ethics, as demonstrated by their decision to extend an invitation to Moira to become their Minister of Genetics, despite her well-documented history of profoundly unethical practices. After all, what are ethics but a barrier to progress put in place by those too small-minded to see the big picture? Part 4.9. Volskaya Industries. Volskaya Industries, like Lumerico, rode the post-crisis industrial wave into significant profits producing mechs, and once the Siberian Omnium reactivated, it began producing Svyatogor defense mechs to guard the cities. Look, it took me a few tries to try and get that right. I'm sorry if I'm saying it wrong. Its CEO, Katya Volskaya, is hugely influential thanks to the company, particularly now that they're back on war footing. Russia had had to fight alone in the first Omnic crisis, and it was preparing to do so again with Volskaya's armaments. In other words, they're an arms manufacturer. But there's a plot twist. They're getting their tech from the Omnics, a fact that Sombra later uses to blackmail them. Does the corporation care about the people? No, obviously, it's a corporation. Volskaya Industries does what's best for Katya Volskaya and the shareholders, not the Russian people. It produces giant war mechs because it makes her money, and she'll use the tech she got from the Omnics to do it if it means she can make better mechs that make more money. Katya doesn't just want Russia to win the war. She wants them to win with mechs with the Volskaya logo on them so that she herself can be a hero with all the power and privilege that'll bring. Katya is a consequentialist, which is the philosophical stance that the morality of your actions is defined by the outcome. In other words, the ends justifying the means. For herself, this basically means ethical egoism, or the idea that your actions are ethical if they benefit you, not only in her decision to trade with the Omnics, but also her decision to enlist Zarya to silence Sombra to cover it up. For Volskaya Industries, it's all about capitalism. What makes the shareholders happy, and what brings the greatest profits for the lowest cost. If that happens to mean trading with the enemy and passing off that research as your own, well, let the arms manufacturer who is without sin cast the first stone. Alright, at this point I think you've sat through enough of my rambling, at least for the first part of this, so that's where we're going to end things for this video. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out part 2 when it comes out on Sunday. Also, before I go, be sure to come by to say hi on Twitch. I'll be continuing with the Donathon for a while longer, so I'm live most days from like 10 AM to midnight my time, and if you'd like to prolong the Donathon and get to vote in the next Members' Choice poll, you can do so by getting a channel membership for $5 by clicking the join button below. Thank you very much to all my channel members. Mini Q, Olesp, Cage the Orc, The Afro of Doom, Nballs, Fish Toast, Kirby PPG, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Destiny, Popsnack, Connor, Circo, Yoshi of the Wire, It's Peggy BTW, Remy, Catlover192, Sourdough, Illuma Riley, Venus, Monkey12 Ninja, Cadence, and Dem. If you stuck around to the end of the video, thank you very much for watching, whether you're a member, a subscriber, or you just stopped by to watch a video. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you around again soon.